Welcome everyone. The webinar will begin at the top of the hour and will be recorded. Connect with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account @ReadingByThird. Please use the hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learn from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. So once again, the campaign wants to connect with you on Facebook. Like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account @ReadingByThird. The webinar will begin shortly. It will be recorded and shared with you afterwards.
Welcome to today's special webinar on COVID-19, making sense of the federal stimulus bills to support children and families. I'm Yolie Flores, and I didn't have my video on. I'm Yolie Flores, Chief Learning Officer for the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you all for joining us. I'll get us started with just a few housekeeping details. First, we'd love you to introduce yourself. So please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to share your name, city or state, and your organization. And be sure to select panelists and attendees so that we all know who is here. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but we encourage your engagement by posting questions in the Q&A box. We will spend the last 20 minutes responding to the questions that you post during the discussion. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be emailed next week to all who registered. And finally, we will be posting a brief on-screen evaluation during the Q&A, and we highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. Before we begin, I'll say just a brief word about our GLR Learning Tuesdays webinar series. The campaign is building on its commitment to bring to the GLR network a more predictable and reliable set of learning opportunities, meaning that you can rely on high-value learning webinars every Tuesday. They're almost always, except today, at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. On the screen, you'll see some of our upcoming learning events, including this afternoon's webinar on homeschool communications and how behavioral science can help us communicate with parents and families so that they can help their kids. Our webinars serve as a portal to access and explore the best ideas, strategies, and programs for our work to ensure early school success for more children from low-income families. So with all those details out of the way, let's get started on today's topic. We're all seeing and experiencing just how disruptive COVID-19 has been to the lives of children and families across the country, especially low-income families and their children. And we know that the closure of schools and early childhood programs will result in lost ground for school readiness, attendance, and summer learning, the campaign's priority focus areas. More children will start school further behind. The uncertainty around whether schools will close again will complicate the messaging around attendance. And the learning loss from the extended closure will test the limits of what we know about summer learning loss. Further, The supports that families need to support their children are simply not there or are incredibly fragmented. Unfortunately, the road to early school success has gotten much longer. Congress recently passed 3 stimulus bills in an effort to mitigate some of the impacts of COVID-19. 2 of these bills, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act and the CARES Act, provide billions of dollars to support families and to promote ongoing learning by supporting schools. But just what is being funded? How will these dollars flow? How will we know that these resources will reach our most vulnerable families? And how can local philanthropy leverage these dollars? We have a great panel to help us answer these questions. So let me introduce them to you and we'll get started. First, we're honored and privileged to have John B. King Jr. join us. John is president of the CEO of the Education Trust, a national nonprofit organization that seeks to identify and close the educational opportunity and achievement gaps. John served as U.S. Secretary of Education in the Obama administration. Prior to that role, John carried out the duties of Deputy Secretary, overseeing policies and programs related to P-12 education, English learners, special education, innovation, and agency operations. John joined the department following his post as New York State Education Commissioner. And John began his career as a high school social studies teacher and a middle school principal. Welcome, John. Next is Denise Forte. Denise is the Senior Vice President for Partnership and Engagement at the Education Trust, where she brings strategic leadership to the organization's efforts to engage policymakers and diverse coalitions of advocates in demanding and securing equity advancing policy change at the national and state levels. Denise spent 20 years in progressively senior congressional staff roles, most recently as the staff director for the House Committee on Education and the Workforce. Denise also served in the Obama administration at the U.S. Department of Education, where she held the positions of Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary and Acting Assistant Secretary in the Office of Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development. And I will add that I'm a proud member of the Board of Education Trust, so I'm really thrilled that both John and Denise could join us today. Next, we have Dr. Ruth Friedman. Dr. Friedman is an independent consultant working with nonprofits, foundations, membership organizations, and the government to improve the policies that support child and family well-being. As a consultant, she worked closely with the Office of Head Start to develop new programmatic and early learning standards. She is executive director of the National Child Abuse Coalition and co-directs the SRCD State Policy Fellowship. Ruth spent 12 years with the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Education and Labor, where she spearheaded numerous legislative initiatives on Head Start, childcare, home visiting, pre-K, child welfare, and juvenile justice. Next, we have Etienne Melcher-Philbin. Etienne joined the Food Research and Action Center, or FRAC, in 2007. In her current role as Senior Policy Analyst, she works with a diverse group of national and state partners to ensure low-income students have access to the school meals programs. She works with school districts across the country to successfully adopt community eligibility and implement breakfast after the bell models. In her previous role as FRAC's Senior Legislative and Policy Affairs Associate, she worked with FRAC's network and Congress, advocating for federal legislation to improve access and participation in domestic anti-hunger programs. Next, we have Farah Fries-Buff, who currently serves as Senior Technical Advisor in Child Nutrition Programs at FNS, overseeing the direct certification with Medicaid demonstration and leading implementation of pandemic EBT, or what is now called PEBT. Before FNS, Farah spent more than 9 years with the Office of Management and Budget, where she led budget and policy development and advised senior officials on federal programs that serve vulnerable children and families, such as SNAP, child welfare programs, Head Start, and home visiting. And last but not least is our discussant, Sharon Darling. Sharon Darling is the founder and president of the National Center for Families Learning, or NCFL. Founded in 1989, NCFL was established to design and implement educational solutions for families to overcome the inequities in education that greatly influence the life trajectory of low-income vulnerable families. NCFL is recognized as the leader in the field of 2-gen learning and provides learning opportunities that serve over 4 million families annually and reach over 15 million parents and children in 138 countries through its award-winning Wonderopolis. Sharon is widely recognized for her contributions to society, including receiving the National Humanities Medal and the Albert Schweitzer Prize for Humanitarianism. That is our rock star panel for today. I want to get us started. And John, I'm going to ask you the first question so that you can help us set the context here. So John, 3 stimulus bills, 2 of which are especially relevant for our conversation. Just in general, what does this all mean for the millions of young preschool children, school-age children, and their families? We have never in our lifetime not had school. And now parents are having to play the role of teacher, many without the needed technology tools or even the understanding of how to help their kids access online learning, especially if they're little kids. Also, for many students, school was the only place for a decent meal. And in terms of school outcomes, for low-income kids and kids of color, the disparities were already huge. What can we expect, and how do these stimulus bills help us?
Thanks for the question, Yolie, and thanks for the opportunity to join you, and thanks everyone for joining this conversation. You know, as we think about the stimulus, we have to view it in the context that COVID-19 has really exacerbated and brought into sharper relief inequities that were always present. And we see it with the health disparities we knew impacted African-American and Latino communities, but then we're seeing those health disparities play out in the disparate impact of COVID-19. When you think about a city like Chicago, where African-Americans make up about 30% of the population of the city, but 70% of the people who are dying from COVID-19. We see the impact of disparities in our economy. We know that the economic crisis that COVID-19 has created is disproportionately impacting low-income communities and communities of color. And then we see it in education. We had inequities before COVID-19. Before COVID-19, it was already true that as a country, we were too often giving the least to the students who need the most. Students of color and low-income students were less likely to get access to quality early childhood education, less likely to have access to well-prepared teachers. Their schools were receiving less resources. They were less likely to have access to advanced coursework, less likely to have access to school counselors. So it's in that context of existing inequities that we have this COVID-19 crisis and school closures. And we see, unfortunately, the devastating impact that that's having on communities. You mentioned, Yolie, the issue of food, and I know we'll talk further about that in this conversation, but we have more than 20 million kids who rely on school for meals every day. Schools are doing heroic work to try to distribute meals, but we know that too many kids and families are hungry. As schools have closed, they've moved to distance learning, but we know we already had a digital divide before COVID-19. Too many low-income kids without access to devices and without access to adequate bandwidth in order to be able to access the internet. We know from, for example, Pew Research that 79% of white families have access to bandwidth. Only 66% of African-American families and only 61% of Latino families, and we know there are communities where those numbers are even more stark. Beyond devices and bandwidth, we know that many of the highest need school districts did not have previous professional development or experience with using distance learning and ed tech tools with their teachers and students. And so the shift to distance learning, which happened virtually overnight, has been incredibly challenging in those school communities. And we know that there are disparities in the level of parent support that's available to kids. Only about 20% of the African Americans in the workforce are able to work from home. So that means that we've got folks who are working outside the home. Their kids are working at home independently on their distance learning. We have other kids who have two parents who are working at home and who are able to support them. And so when those kids come back to school in September, the disparities will be even wider in terms of their educational experience. The hopeful thing about the stimulus is that there are dollars available to try to tackle these issues. And Denise will talk in more detail about the specifics of the stimulus. But I'd say there are two areas that we are most concerned about. One, how do we tackle learning loss? How do we make sure that we have instructional continuity between now and the return to school? But then when kids come back, we know kids will have lost ground. How do we make sure that students have access to summer school, extended learning time, intensive tutoring, all the supports necessary to make up the ground that they've lost? So that instructional continuity and then instructional support when kids come back to school, critical. But we also know there's a socio-emotional impact to all of this. Kids who are in homes where there's domestic violence or substance addiction, kids who are in communities where there's violence, kids who are in homes that are abusive. And for those kids, being at home for months is going to be adding to their trauma. For other kids, job loss in the family or illness in the family as a result of COVID-19 will cause home to be this very stressful environment. So it's critically important that we provide socio-emotional supports to students now, interventions to try to address their mental health needs. And it will be important when students come back to school, whether that's in the summer or the fall, that we have robust counseling and socio-emotional supports for students. So we think there are urgent needs that these stimulus dollars should be used to meet. I'll say finally, for me, when I think about the impact of school closure, school played this crucial role in my life as a kid growing up in Brooklyn. Both my parents passed away. My mom when I was 8, my dad when I was 12, and it was school that saved my life. School was the place that was structured and supportive and nurturing and consistent. I can't imagine what it would have been like to be without school for months. And so we have to have tremendous urgency about getting resources and support to the kids for whom school will be the difference between hope and despair in their lives. So with that context, I want to turn it over to Denise to talk about the CARES Act in particular, and where we are as well in conversations about what we hope will be an even larger stimulus for, because the needs are quite significant.
Thank you, John, and thank you for sharing your story about why school matters to so many children and so many of our young people. And thank you for setting that context. So Denise, given that context, help us make sense of the stimulus bills. Together, as I said earlier, and as John has said, they represent billions of dollars. Where will this money go, or where is it going? How will it flow? And more importantly, how do we as an extended community of people that care about children and families and their well-being, how do we all play a role to ensure that these dollars reach our most vulnerable kids and their families?
Thanks, Yolie. At the Education Trust, we are particularly aware of the impact of advocacy at the state and local level. That is part of the work that I oversee. And so much of what we try to do is communicate to advocates how they can best, one, how to get them informed on the information that's out there, and two, provide them with the skills to effectively advocate to state leaders and policymakers to ensure that the kids who we are concerned with the most, students of color, students from low-income families, students with disabilities, homeless children, children in the juvenile justice system, have access to the systems that they need, which hopefully can start to narrow the inequities. Let me share with you, as John mentioned earlier, there are several stimulus packages that were recently enacted. I'm really going to focus on just one of them, the CARES Act, but I did want to sort of share with you some of the backdrop on the earlier packages, starting with the Education Stabilization Fund. So looking at the overview of congressional action to date, there has been, and currently if anybody's tracking what's going on in the Senate, we may see a fourth package pass the Senate today, but there was a bill passed, HR 6074, which was passed in March, which provided around $8.3 billion in emergency funding. That bill was primarily focused on vaccine development, equipment stockpiles, supporting state and local health budgets. It did not contain any education or workforce related provisions. The second bill that was passed includes probably one of the more significant policy actions when it comes to children in schools to date. And this was provided about $1 billion in nutritional aid, and our friends from FRAC, as well as USDA, will talk to us about those provisions. And then lastly, in the most recent bill, the CARES Act, has 3 different provisions related to education: an Education Stabilization Fund, P-12 provisions, and we will be talking to you also about how those funds are sent down to states and institutions, as well as what we think is primarily the big get there, the things that we should be focused on the most. So moving to the Education Stabilization Fund. Next slide. Thank you. That bill in the CARES Act, that provision included $30.75 billion in total for K-12 and higher education. Now, we will say at the Education Trust, we feel that there's more to be done. This was a significant investment, but if many of you remember from the Great Recession, over $100 billion was put in for education alone. And we are working very hard to increase that number in the subsequent rounds of stimulus bills. Within this particular stabilization fund, however, governors received $3 billion. And in fact, the application for governors to submit for those dollars is already out on the Department of Education's website, as well as your state's allocation of those funds. $13.5 billion for K-12, and then another $14.25 billion for higher education. Let me walk briefly through some of the P-12 provisions in the next slide. As I mentioned before, $13.5 billion. A big win here is the fact that these funds will go through the Title I formula, which is based on poverty. And that means that the states will be able to get funds allocated to the percentage of students that are low income in their states. It also includes a maintenance of effort provision, which says that states are to continue providing the same level of funding that they have in the past, over the past 3 years. This can be waived by the secretary, but it is still an important provision, and we would urge you to stay closely monitoring that. And the last thing is the funds have to be spent by September 30th, 2021, which is important because it will go through the entirety of the next school year. This provision also included, if we can back up one, sorry, thanks. Increased waiver authority for the Secretary of Education. As you have probably heard, most states have already asked for it and been approved to have their annual state assessment waived. There are also some fiscal provisions, some good, some less good, that can be waived. And then the secretary is supposed to be making recommendations to Congress for other waivers in IDEA, ESEA, the Elementary, Secondary, and Education Act, and the Carl D. Perkins Career and Technical Education Act. I will say here that this is something that I would encourage you again to watch out for if any of your states are making recommendations in terms of some of these waivers. IDEA in particular protects some of our most vulnerable students, and making sure that they are continued to be served, particularly in terms of this loss of learning, is very important. And we don't want those students to lose their entitled protections in law. And then lastly, Ruth will cover a little bit about this. Increased funding for Head Start, again, so important. The Child Care Development Block Grant, and additional funding for runaway and homeless youth. We can go to the next slide. So in terms of funds getting out to states and institutions, as I mentioned earlier, the governors have their own allocation. In terms of the K-12 funds, however, the secretary has yet to put the application up online. We have been checking pretty much on a regular basis. We're not quite sure what the holdup is, but we would expect the application to go up soon. As I said before, funds will be received via the Title I allocation, and then even within states, the funds have to be sent out through the in-state Title I allocation. Governor's Fund, again, similar, and as I mentioned before, the application is already up. Next slide. Some of the implications for P-12 education, we can move to the next slide. You will be able to check on edtrust.org for a variety of resources that we have outlined for COVID-19, things that we think that are particularly necessary for both state and local leaders to be aware of. And we believe that there are bright spots out there for state and local leaders who are already doing some of this work. But if you do find that you believe your states need additional support, here are some of the things that we believe can make sure to push on the equity levers that are available to you, and that can make sure that the kids that we are most focused on are getting served. First and foremost, clear and regular communications with community stakeholders. State leaders need to be sharing with you what's going on the regular school day, what they anticipate for the summer, and how they believe that these funds will be allocated within the state. And then, of course, the critical supports for students and families in need. And this is not just academic supports. As John mentioned earlier, we are going to need significant additional attention paid to mental health supports, not just for students, but also for teachers who will be going through many of the same things that their students have been going through. And then guidance and resources to districts on the services for vulnerable populations. We have been trying to pay particular attention to homeless children who we believe at this time are particularly at risk. There will be additional services that are available to them through the McKinney-Vento Homeless Education Program. Each state has a McKinney-Vento Homeless Coordinator, and all school districts are supposed to have a McKinney-Vento Homeless Coordinator. We believe making sure that they are also having clear and regular communications with stakeholders is particularly important. And then none of us really know how long this pandemic will last, but we do anticipate that, based on what public health officers are telling us, that there could be several waves of the pandemic. If that is the case, states and school districts need to be prepared for short and long-term solutions. We will soon find out when schools anticipate opening up again or what types of services they plan for the fall. But we also need to be looking beyond that in case schools close throughout the year, and make sure that when we're thinking about learning loss, when we're thinking about mental health supports, that those are all factored in. And then the last thing that we think state leaders have to do is that those funds have to be distributed and used equitably. In many instances, this means emphasizing those communities that have the highest low income population, as well as making sure that additional funds could be sent to those low income populations, as well as including additional supports that would be highly targeted to those communities that need the most. Next slide, please. And I think that's, oh, yes, one more. Thanks. How do we ensure that states are going to make sure the stimulus dollars are going to be distributed and used equitably? The key thing is being very focused on our districts. You want districts to have an equity-centered plan when using the funding, being able to identify all the different resources that they have available. And for many instances, this is not just about funding. We're talking about the availability of remote and distance learning, the availability of strong teachers to be available, the availability of the EL supports and supports for kids with disabilities. Mentioned before, the public reporting, that is really going to be important. Sadly, the federal law that enacted the CARES program did not include a lot of public reporting, but honestly, in our communities, that is really the only way that we're going to be able to find out how those funds are allocated and what those funds are being used for. And then lastly, and I know I've been hitting on this one a lot, the governor's discretionary fund is exactly that. It is discretionary and up to the governor on how it is to be used, which makes it even more important that you as public stakeholders, taxpayers, folks who are particularly interested in protecting the needs of our low income and students of color, students with disability, homeless kids, juvenile justice kids, that they are getting the funds not only that they need, but they deserve. Again, I'm going to pitch edtrust.org as an additional resource for you. We have some really great articles that we've been curating, as well as blogs. You can find many of the things that I've talked about here in that website, as well as other things that we've identified from the CARES program that we believe that our state and district leaders should be paying more attention to.
Great, thank you, Denise. I have put in the chat box a couple of times a link directly to your website and where all the resources are that you have been posting. So thank you for tracking and for staying so close to every day what we know, what is happening, and giving everybody the big picture. And I love your encouragement for all of us to play a role in making sure that in each of our states, and that it trickles down into our communities, but that we have an ability to push for what we know our kids need, especially our most vulnerable kids. Ruth, I'm gonna turn to you now. I know you've been paying a lot of attention to our youngest children. What is the landscape now in terms of early care and education? Help us understand those dollars in the CARES Act, and how will this help in the immediate?
Thanks, Yolie, and thank you for giving me a chance to talk to you about this today. So the landscape with early education is complicated and still evolving. We have a mix of childcare directives right now going on at the state, but I want everyone to keep this framework in mind. So at the time that the governors closed schools to protect the safety of students and staff, and at the same time that the CDC has advised parents not to allow their children to have play dates with kids from other households, and the CDC has declared that children meeting in groups because it puts children should not meet in groups because it puts everyone at risk. At the same time that we have these directives, only one state has chosen to close group childcare. So when we're thinking about the childcare landscape, please remember that it is very much directed by the need for families to work, not directed by what is best for the children that are attending those centers, and certainly not what is best for the staff that are taking care of those children. So the state of play right now is that 16 states have closed childcare with the exception of care for essential workers. Some states have made modifications, such as no more than 10 kids in a classroom. But even in states where childcare has not been closed by the governor, many programs are closing due to low enrollment and revenue. So for example, Florida, where childcare has not been closed, the majority of programs actually have closed because of low enrollment and revenue. There are different actions that governors have taken to address their childcare rules right now. Importantly, states are paying for the childcare of essential workers regardless of income. Some have been increasing the reimbursement rates to providers. Some have been providing bonus or hazard pay. Some states have given grants to incentivize childcare or grants to help them with hygiene practices. There's actually been some very good coordination between some school districts and childcare programs where school districts have been able to share their cleaning products, which they don't need right now with childcare programs. But there have also been changes to childcare rules in concerning ways. Some states have actually suspended or relaxed licensing standards, allowing more kids to be in a classroom. One of the most important things that has happened is that most states have switched their childcare assistance programs to be based on enrollment instead of attendance. This is really important because it means that some childcare providers are able to keep receiving funding, even if their program is closed or reducing operations. This is a really key policy goal broadly for the childcare market because it will be really important for retaining a childcare supply when the economy opens back up. The CDC has issued guidance to childcare, but the reality is that most of this guidance isn't feasible. So for example, their guidance for childcare centers includes covering coughs and sneezes, which for those of you familiar with young children, that's just unrealistic. Naps are supposed to take place 6 feet apart. Many childcare centers don't have the facilities that allow that. The guidance recommends teachers who hold or comfort a crying child is supposed to change the child's clothes and their own shirt right afterwards. The nature of early care and learning is inherently relational, and these guidelines just really are not feasible. We also have a lot of concern, even though young children seem to be less susceptible to the virus. Experts think that this may be that they're more likely to be asymptomatic when infected. So temperature checks going on when kids enter centers is likely not a great way of identifying children who are infected with the virus. And some childcare experts are actually calling for the closure of all group programs until there can be much better testing protocols in place. So turning to the federal response for childcare right now, the CARES Act did provide $3.5 billion to the Child Care Development and Block Grant Fund that goes to states, tribes, and territories. It also provided key
Ruth, your video froze. Are you still there? I think we lost Ruth. Ruth, we're not able to hear you. Ruth, why don't we come back to you, and I'm going to, we'll move to Etienne. And if we could advance the slides, Jerry, until Ruth comes back. Yeah, if you could advance to, I think it was slide 30. So Etienne, let's go to you, and I know Ruth will come back as soon as she can. You're going to talk to us about school meals. We know that millions of children across the country rely on school meals every day. So what are the implications for thousands of kids that need these meals, and how does the pandemic EBT and the Families First Act try to remedy that?
Well, thank you for that question, inviting me here to be a part of this conversation. On an average school day, 22 million low-income children rely on free and reduced price meals at school. As schools continue to remain closed due to COVID-19, low-income families have lost access to these critical programs and the nutrition they provide indefinitely. Many more children are also becoming eligible due to the coronavirus's impact on the economy. To respond to this crisis, states and school districts are leveraging the federal nutrition programs to help struggling families. During this difficult and unprecedented time that includes the need to social distance, USDA has authorized various flexibilities to help break down the barriers states face to ensure children and their families can access food. Today, I want to highlight an amazing opportunity that was included in the Families First Act, Pandemic EBT. Next slide. There you go. Also known as PEBT for short. PEBT was designed to provide nutrition resources to families to replace the school meals they typically receive when school is open. Families are provided an EBT card to purchase food at retailers that accept SNAP. So who is eligible for PEBT? The question I get a lot now. Eligible children include all those that are certified to receive free and reduced price school meals. Children who attend schools that offer free meals to all students through community eligibility or provision 2 during the normal school day, as well as students whose families have become newly eligible due to the crisis. PEBT benefits are based on the value of free breakfast and lunch, since the basis of this program is to replace school meals. That equates to approximately $5.70 a day for each student. For 4 weeks, that's about $114 per student. These benefits can add up and provide much needed support to families. I also want to flag that states can issue these benefits retroactively to the day schools close, schools closed in the state. For a state to provide PEBT benefits to households, the state's SNAP and child nutrition agencies must submit a joint plan to USDA that describes how they will operate PEBT. USDA has issued PEBT guidance and a Q&A on developing plans. I believe my colleague Farah from USDA will be speaking shortly about what they are hearing from states on their proposed plans. In their plans, states must outline how they will provide PEBT benefits to both SNAP and non-SNAP households, the amount of benefit they plan to disperse, anticipated implementation date, as well as a communications plan to get the word out to eligible families. As states develop plans, we are encouraging states to think about how they can provide benefits to as many children as seamlessly as possible, especially to those non-SNAP households. Every state's plan will look different since every state has different data and technological capabilities. Ideally, states can draw from existing data for as many eligible families as possible and minimize the number that must apply. Options can include drawing on existing direct certification systems for school meals, the student data available at the state level, and other data sources, including Medicaid and potentially CHIP, that could provide a path for providing benefits who do not participate in SNAP. So looking to school meals, another great opportunity to provide meals to struggling families. We've been working with states and school districts across the country since school has been closed to start up meal distribution sites at school sites, parks and rec, YMCA's, and other community sites such as parks. And these meals can be provided through the summer nutrition programs and can operate alongside PEBT. The Families First Act also authorized USDA to issue a number of nationwide and state waivers to provide meals in a way that supports social distancing and addresses the urgent crisis. School districts and other community partners can and should utilize these waivers to provide flexibility and remove the barriers to children. Meals can now be provided outside of congregate feeding settings. Providers are able to offer multiple meals at the same time, up to a week's worth, and have flexibility with meal service times, along with many other flexibilities. We have identified a number of best practices to ensure access to these meals. First and foremost, ensuring that sites are set up throughout the community where children or their parents can pick up meals through grab and go and drive-through models. They can utilize existing bus routes to deliver meals to families. That's especially popular in rural communities, and partner with other school districts and community partners to maximize the reach of these programs. We've created a guide that we are continuously updating that highlights best practices and innovative models that we've seen over the past few weeks, as well as USDA's guidance on these programs. And I've linked to that at the in my last slide for folks to take a look at. We are also, in addition to working with states to implement PEBT and set up meal sites through the summer programs, we are also working hard to ensure that future legislative packages include additional assistance to struggling families. We're asking Congress to boost the SNAP maximum benefits by 15%, increase the minimum benefit from $16 to $30, and suspend all the SNAP administrative rules that would terminate or cut benefits. Additionally, we're also asking Congress to extend pandemic EBT. Like I said, it's a very exciting opportunity to provide supports to families. And right now, these benefits are available to the end of the school year, and we want to extend that through the summer. And so here are just some of the links to the resources I mentioned throughout the presentation. I encourage you to check them out, as well as the other resources not mentioned on our COVID-19, that I haven't mentioned, and really want to say thank you for the opportunity to participate in today's webinar, and look forward to answering questions at the end. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Etienne. We'll bring Ruth back on after Farah, because Farah from USDA is going to do a bit of follow-up to pandemic EBT. So let's jump right in. Farah, you've been on the front lines at USDA working on the PEBT legislation and its rollout. What are you hearing from states? What's the status of the implementation? And how are we ensuring that families are taking full advantage of this critical part of the stimulus?
Well, thanks, Yolie, and thank you again for including USDA in today's conversation. We at USDA are working to support our state partners as they implement the new pandemic EBT program. Etienne shared a great overview of the PEBT program, so I'll try to build on what she shared. The first thing I'll share is that although PEBT is an optional program for states, we are hearing tremendous interest from states who do want to provide these benefits to vulnerable children. Although the program builds on the SNAP infrastructure, PEBT is not SNAP and it's not school meals. It's a brand new program that comes with a host of new challenges for states. The success of PEBT in a state really requires strong partnerships between the state agencies that administer SNAP, the state agency that runs child nutrition, oftentimes a different agency that is in charge of education, and in some cases also local school districts and schools. And it's been really exciting to see those partnerships in action already. States are doing very impressive and innovative work developing plans to quickly identify and issue benefits to children and families in need, while also ensuring that the benefits go to the intended recipients. So far, USDA has approved 6 states to issue PEBT benefits. I saw this question in the chat. They are Michigan, Rhode Island, North Carolina, Massachusetts, Arizona, and Illinois. And we are actively working with at least 18 other states to get their plans approved, likely more once I go and check my inbox after the webinar. As was already explained, the purpose of PEBT is to provide EBT cards for groceries to all children who otherwise would be receiving free or reduced price meals if schools weren't closed. So states that choose to participate must serve both both children in households that participate in SNAP and children in non-SNAP households. As Etienne was saying, the biggest technical challenge for our states is compiling the information they need to identify children that would otherwise be receiving free or reduced price meals and to get them the EBT benefits at the correct address. While schools and districts have the lists of free and reduced price eligible students, states often don't. So some of our states are able to use existing data to provide benefits to both SNAP and non-SNAP households without families having to do anything. Other states are working to quickly assemble the needed data, and some are actually using a combination approach. They're using applications in combination with their administrative data to identify eligible children and issue benefits. The state plans, I think as Etienne said well, appropriately reflect the different capabilities and strengths of each state's system. States are also finding really innovative ways to identify eligible children who attend participating non-public schools, but aren't always included in student enrollment lists. And they're working through sort of how to communicate with and reach children that attend schools that participate in the community eligibility provision, or CEP, where all children eat for free, where those children or families may not think of themselves as eligible for or receiving free or reduced price meals, but that are eligible for PEBT benefits. Supporting states as they implement PEBT is in line with our commitment to keep Americans safe and healthy during this emergency and to keep kids fed when they're not in school. We look forward to continued partnership, and I'm happy to answer questions that folks might have.
Great, thank you, Farah. And John was responding to some of the questions on the chat for folks that were asking about what EBT stands for, electronic benefit transfer. And then John, I think you knew who some of the first states were to be approved. Do you want to say a little bit about that? Except you're on mute.
Sure. So the first state was Michigan, and then Rhode Island, and then Massachusetts and North Carolina were approved, and Arizona and Illinois. I think it's helpful for folks to look at the plans from those states, and you know, as was mentioned, I think there's some complexity in building the data sharing that's necessary to get the electronic benefit transfer cards to families that are not SNAP participants. And so there's an opportunity for states to learn from each other here that I hope folks will take advantage of.
Great. And John, when you and I first spoke about this a couple of weeks ago, you were really excited about this part of the legislation, having an EBT card. Why does that matter?
Well, what we know is that the summer meals program actually gets relatively low participation. So only 1 in 6 of the students who are eligible for school year free and reduced price lunch meals participate in the summer meals program because it's difficult to get to the school site to get the meals. And so even though districts are doing heroic work now, and they're because of USDA's flexibility, they're doing grab and go meals, and adults are able to pick up the meals without kids being with them, it's still not enough, and we are not seeing the level of participation that we would like. And we know from the pilot summer EBT program that's been in existence for several years that participation is much higher. When people can use the dollars at the grocery store, they get food, and it means that kids are fed. And we also are seeing in some states the cafeteria workers who are working on meal distribution get sick, and then districts having to pause the programs. So our view is that the pandemic EBT is the best path available to get food to as many kids as possible during this crisis. And, you know, particularly as this goes on through the school year into the summer, anything we can do to make sure kids have a reliable food source, we should do.
Great, thank you, John. And Farah, thank you, and USDA for all the work that you've been doing on this. Really appreciate it. I think this is gonna help, well, we know it's gonna help many, many families. So Ruth is back. There was a windstorm in her community, which is what knocked her off of Zoom. So we're gonna bring her back to continue talking about our babies, our preschoolers, toddlers, kids in early care and education. So Ruth, I think you were on this slide, so let's continue.
Thank you. I apologize, and I also cannot promise that I'm not going to get kicked off Wi-Fi again with the next big wind gust. We had just finished discussing the $3.5 billion for CCDBG. We don't know how the governors are going to choose to allocate it. It is an extremely flexible law, and the CARES Act provided these additional flexibilities as well. You can move to the next one. I wanted to just quickly touch on some other federal responses which are relevant to the childcare community. The first is the various types of expanded unemployment insurance benefits. Not only did unemployment insurance get expanded by an additional 13 weeks and include a $600 federal supplement, but there is also a new program developed for folks who are often not typically employed, typically covered under unemployment insurance. Unfortunately, that's not yet up and running, but when it is, that will be helpful to people in the childcare community who are self-employed or independent contractors. Then there's the Paycheck Protection Program and the EIDL program. Both of these are meant to be one-time short-term loans. If you've been paying close attention to the news, you will learn that these both ran out of money relatively quickly, but they are for both small businesses and nonprofits. So most childcare programs are eligible for these loan programs. And the important part here is that under the PPP, if 75% of the loan is put towards payroll, then the loan is entirely forgiven over the course of 8 weeks. And with the EIDL, the first 10,000 is a grant, not a loan. So if those actually had enough money in it, we are hoping more money is going to flow from DC later this week on these. These are some things that can help, though they definitely are not the solution for childcare solvency. There are also federal tax credits that provide federal reimbursement for paid and sick family leave that may be useful for childcare programs as well. Moving on to Head Start. Head Start looks a little bit more like K-12 than it does with childcare in terms of responding to COVID. That's because it has a very different infrastructure than the childcare system in this country. So what we know at this point is that most Head Start programs are not operating normally. I've put that number up on the screen, that's 96%. That is not a verified source. That is what I am hearing. Don't quote me on that. But the bottom line is most are closed for operations, and some may be operating virtually in some cases, and likely the family services that are so integral to the Head Start program are likely still continuing in some degree. The Office of Head Start has directed programs to continue to pay benefits to staff unable to work because of COVID or COVID closures. And that, of course, is really important to retaining the workforce and the continued solvency of the Head Start programs. The CARES Act did include $750 million for Head Start. $500 million was for programs to run supplemental summer programs, which, as you all know well, is a really important thing to do in terms of allowing programs to help make up for lost time. Obviously, this has not been doled out yet because programs are still closed. I should also mention that $500 million is not enough to extend supplemental summer programs to all preschool age kids in Head Start. So more money would be necessary for that to reach everyone. It also includes, the CARES program also includes $250 million for one-time specific actions related to COVID. You can see a list of type of expenditures there on the slide. I'm going to move on to what is next at the federal level. And as I said, the small business loans should be seeing more funding in the coming days, which is good news, but no one in the early childhood field feels that that is the answer for ensuring that there is a child care system to go back to once the economy, quote unquote, opens back up. Advocates are working to get $50 billion in child care assistance into the next federal COVID package. But there are a lot of challenges around this. It's really important when we think about how the community needs to react next to remember that early care and learning system in this country is mainly a private pay system for a public good. And that creates an infrastructure with real challenges. The U.S. is primarily paying for child care through low wages and parent fees. And we just don't have the stable infrastructure in childcare like we do with K-12, with Head Start, and with some state pre-K. Although I will mention some state pre-K, is delivered through private settings, and that infrastructure is a little bit uncertain because those are usually mixed classrooms. To give you a sense of what we're talking about in terms of the number of kids in the systems, it is really important to keep in mind that most kids are not in publicly funded programs. We have 21 million children under the age of 5. 44% of 4-year-olds are in public pre-K, but keep in mind that most public pre-K does not even cover a full school day, let alone a working day. So many of those 4-year-olds are in a variety of settings, including childcare settings. Only 16% of 3-year-olds are in public pre-K. And importantly, we've been talking about CCDBG, but only 870,000 children get childcare assistance through CCDBG. That means most low-income families do not receive childcare assistance. So when we're thinking about what sort of childcare policies need to be put in place, we need to think more broadly than just the means-tested program. Otherwise, programs are going to close, they're not going to reopen, and staff will not return. So just quickly wrapping up, we have both child-focused concerns and infrastructure concerns. As I mentioned at the beginning, safety is a real issue. Childcare and early education is inherently set up to not meet the conditions that are good for reducing COVID infection. We also obviously have lost learning time. We have the stress and the trauma that children and families are undergoing that is particularly acute for children who are in their first years of life. Family economic stress is extremely high right now. That too has a large impact on child development. Head Start, relatively speaking, is in good shape. It has strong and stable funding. It has a whole family approach, which means that Head Start programs are really already focused and knowledgeable on how to help families in times of crisis, in times of stress. That is much less true about our state pre-K programs across the country. Head Start also has mental health services built in, not enough in my opinion, and certainly not enough to, I think, meet the challenges that we're gonna see when programs reopen, but certainly a big leg up on both the child care field and state pre-K, which typically does not have those sorts of services built in. And then childcare is a different story. You know, it's not in great shape at the best of times, and this is not the best of times. And there are going to be some real challenges. I do think if we see Congress invest a large amount into childcare as part of their next COVID package, there is a really important opportunity to build out this infrastructure in a way that will be really good for children. But childcare is often forgotten about and seen as the province of the family, unlike K-12 education. And so that remains to be seen. And thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. You just laid out why we're so worried, and there's a lot of concern around the sector as a whole. And we'll come back to some questions that folks are asking, but we'll want to know what role we all can play to use this as an opportunity and leverage what the system should look like, but it hasn't looked like. So, and I'm glad your power did not go out again. Thank you all for your great presentations. I want to turn now to my friend and colleague, Sharon Darling, who's joined us as a commentator, respondent. Sharon, thank you for joining us. I know you've been not only following the legislation very closely, but you've been on the front lines of advocating directly to Congress to do right by families. I'd love you to share your thoughts, spurred by the panelists and your own. And I'd also like you to speak more about the role of parents in this crisis. You and I have discussed at length how stressed parents are because we're expecting them now to step in to homeschool their children. Recently, Ralph Smith, my boss, said quite eloquently in his recent managing director's letter, and I'll quote him, "The urgent need to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the reality that parents are more than the proverbial first teacher, brain builder, coach, and advocate. They're the launch pad, the backbone, and the backstop of last resort. And as with public health, family support systems need deep and sustained investment if we expect them to be ready when we need them most." So would love your thoughts, Sharon.
Thank you, and congratulations to all the panelists. This was so informative. The knowledge was terrific that we gained from all of your presentations. And the one theme that flowed through there for me was really about equity, and really about how do we create equity situations for our most vulnerable families. So I think never in the history of our country have we seen a brighter light shine on the inequities in our families.
Sharon, there's something going on with your sound, but let's see if we all go on mute. Okay, let's try again.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's a little fuzzy.
I don't know, it was working earlier.
It was working earlier. We tested you.
You can't hear me?
We can hear you. There's just some rumbling noise. I don't know how to describe it, but let's keep going because what you have to say is important and we'll make the best of it.
I saw what I heard flowing through everybody's presentation was really about equity. And I think never in our history, in our country, have we seen a brighter light shined on the inequity that we see in our families, our most vulnerable families. And for the first time, there's no way that we can deny that parents are critical in the education of children. And parents are really the backbone right now, as Ralph said, about where we are in this nation. So I've been at this for 30 years at the National Center for Families Learning. We work very hard to make sure that families stay at the forefront, that everything we do is about multiple generations, knowing that we're not going to be able to solve this challenge of intergenerational literacy and education with just a single focus, that it really is going to take a much bigger tent and bigger picture. So we've been working to bring parents and children together for many, many years. But I think important part of this is that right now we have an opportunity in this country. You know, I've been the person that's always there saying, well, what about the parent? And always educators will say, well, of course the parent, of course we're going to reach the parent. We're going to tell the parents about their rights and responsibilities. But really right now, people are seeing for the first time how we need to depend on our parents and what our homes and families actually can do and how under-resourced they are in their ability to do the work that they need to. So I want to focus on two things with the CARES funding, the CARES Act, that I think are important for parents. First of all, I think, as I said, this is an opportunity.
Sharon, before you do, we have a suggestion from Sam Fisher. He says, I believe the mic volume might be too high. It sounds like it's being clipped or taking in too much volume. So try turning down your volume and see if that's better. Or maybe moving your computer a little bit further from you.
How about this? Is this better?
A little, maybe. Let's try.
Does that work any better? Can people hear me?
We can hear you, and we can make you out. So go ahead.
Okay. Well, I usually talk with my hands, so maybe that'll help. Maybe some sign language in here might help. So I think when we look at our opportunities, this is an opportunity in time, and I hope we will all take advantage of it to really tell policy leaders and others about how important it is that we provide supports and resources to parents throughout this pandemic, and then put in place a system that will work for the future. You know, we know that parents, you know, if we think about who parents are, we often think about parents as a group. Well, we're going to do this for parents. We're going to do that for parents. But really, when we look at parents, we need to start thinking about how do we match the intensity of the service with the intensity of need of support for parents in this pandemic and beyond. So I think when we look at parents, we know that there are 30 million parents in this country who are the primary caregivers of children under the age of 8 who don't have literacy skills. They don't have the basic skills of literacy, and many of them don't speak English. So we're thinking about all parents. We think about lobbying materials over the fence, which I feel like the country somehow is checked off the box that we now have an opportunity that, you know, we're doing online learning, and so all the children are learning online. Schools are closed, but, you know, we've kind of got that handled. And I think we heard earlier in the presentations that that's really not the case. But I think when we come down to it, everybody's bringing the resources that we can put online, and children can do fun activities with their parents, and they can do all of these things, and they can learn online. But you think about people that I know, like Fiona in Flint, Michigan, who really is in an apartment, a very small apartment with 4 children, and she has a smartphone. She just lost her job as a minimum wage job as a waitress, and her children are all on different levels, and she's trying to provide the resources and support for them that she knows they need. The Indian reservations, we work in 130 communities across the country. We work on 49 Native American reservations across the country, and what we're finding is that, you know, it's not really about a grandmother in a trailer with 8 children with spotty internet access. We're talking about somebody who doesn't have cell phone access, not even dreaming about internet access. So we're pretending sometimes in the country that we've solved some of our problems when in actuality we've only shined a spotlight on what we really need to do. So we know that, you know, poverty and equity in what we're seeing in the home and the family right now, and the children who are confined in those homes and families, we know that we have to do something much more than that. And we know that poverty and the devastating effects that it has on children is something that we really have to tackle and take advantage of this opportunity when people are focused on the home and the family. You know, poverty has dire circumstances for children, but, you know, when we look beyond that, we know that there are no poor children in this country. There are children who live with poor parents, and they don't have skills that they need and knowledge that they need in order to climb out of poverty and provide for their children. So that's why we have to look at a more holistic approach, and we really have to drill down on the parents. The second thing I'd like to say about the CARES Act is that one of the things I'm excited about is that this is flexible resource, that the money that's coming in education has some flexibility to it, and it is focused on vulnerable families. So I think we have an opportunity to build something beyond just a one-off and say, okay, we can use this money for this amount of money for parents or that amount of money for parents. Let's look at it in a broader context and think about what we can do if we brought together all the resources in the state and in the communities that already have a mandate, government funding that already has a mandate to work with parents, particularly around family literacy and the federal definition of family literacy. It's very intensive, deep family engagement. So we can take this opportunity to really build a system. We are working with the statewide family engagement centers across the country. There are 12 of those. 12 states have those for 5-year grants. We're seeing some phenomenal results in building a structure for parents that's going to be sustainable and long-lasting for all parents. And we're also seeing that with these statewide literacy development grants, that they're in 22 states now. The mandate in there for their plan is for parent engagement and deep family literacy. So I think we have opportunities that we've never had before. And I hope that I can take this opportunity. We're offering technical assistance. We've reached out to all the commissioners of education and Title I directors to help them write their state plans, to help them really put in place what we know it's going to take to build a system, and to help them put in place programs and resources that reach our most vulnerable families. So I want to go back to what Ralph said. I mean, I think, his words were so eloquent about the role of the parent now, but I want to make sure that as we think about any of these initiatives, that we really, really focus this time on parents as central, so that our schools and our communities will look very different next year than they do this year, because now we know that it's not an also ran to include parents. It's absolutely critical to the education of our children. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sharon. We all listened very intently through the sound issues and captured all your words of wisdom and the way in which you're helping us think about this in hopeful ways. We have quite a few questions, so I'm going to get us started on our Q&A. And for those of you who have not yet entered your question into the Q&A box, now is a great time to do that. John, I'm going to start with you. And inevitably, there's a lot of concern and for some optimism that digital learning, could be what could be most helpful during this time. What are you seeing in terms of recommended policies to make digital learning accessible and available? So, issues around bandwidth. And what are other policy issues related to that maybe are centered around digital redlining, or how are we just going to create this kind of access that our families need right now?
Lot of questions, a lot we could say there. Maybe 3 things I'd highlight. One is around bandwidth. Bandwidth continues to be a challenge. There are a few things that could be done. One, Congress could allocate more funds to address bandwidth through the E-rate program. That was proposed in the House version of the CARES Act, but didn't make it into the final bill. We'd like to see that in a future stimulus. Folks could address bandwidth with CARES Act dollars by purchasing Wi-Fi, for example. And some school districts are being quite creative. School districts like South Bend, Indiana, they're putting Wi-Fi on school buses and having the school buses parked in communities where there's real challenges around bandwidth access. Another thing we can do on bandwidth is push the cable companies and internet service providers to change their rules. One of the things that we're seeing, and one of the folks asked about this in the Q&A box, we're seeing some of the companies refuse to provide internet service if someone has an outstanding balance, which is obviously a big problem in low-income communities and in the midst of this fiscal crisis. So what we need there is for cable companies to step up and say, look, we're going to provide internet to any family with children because it's essential for the good of our society. We have seen the efforts by community-based organizations like in Oakland to put pressure on internet service providers to do exactly that. So we've got the bandwidth issue, we've got a device issue, and devices are a real challenge in high needs communities. And it's not just having a device in the house, it's having a device that is internet enabled that each child in the home can use to do their work, often simultaneously. And so school districts have to ask good questions of families about what device access they have at the home. and then they have to provide them. And again, they can use CARES Act dollars for this. I think San Antonio School District ordered some 30,000 devices in March for their largely low-income student population to be able to have access. So once we get devices and bandwidth dealt with, then there's the actual instruction. And there, I think we need a lot more professional development and support for teachers in how to do distance learning well. The evidence base is very limited on distance learning, but teachers clearly need more support in designing online lessons, figuring out how to balance some time with asynchronous instruction, maybe a video of the teacher presenting, and then some time with synchronous instruction where the teacher is talking with students or doing small group support for students. Folks need help thinking about how do you help kids plan a project where they set goals and manage their own time, ask questions when they need help, act on the feedback that they're receiving. So there's a lot of work to make distance learning work well, but given that's our reality through at least the summer and potentially into next school year in some places, we've got to make an investment now in getting distance learning at least closer to right.
And a related question from Beth Judah in Sarasota. She leads the GLR campaign there. Some districts are providing tablets or computers, but only through the end of the school year. And she's noting that there's a great benefit for letting the students keep the devices in order to try to mitigate learning loss. What would you recommend to folks at the local level in terms of working with their districts to have them allow kids to keep the devices over the summer?
Yeah, I think an important question for advocates to work on with districts is, what is the plan for summer? Will students be able to continue to access distance learning opportunities over the summer? Will there be summer school if the pandemic allows in some places? Will there be summer academic enrichment programs? Might there be opportunities for high school students to take early college classes over the summer? Northern Virginia Community College just announced this week that they're going to provide college courses for high school juniors and seniors in their region in order to help students get an early start on college. So there may be those kinds of opportunities. So I think that Beth is exactly right. There's an important need for advocates, providers of summer programming, and districts to sit down now to plan for summer 20 and frankly for summer 21 as well, because we're going to have a lot of ground to make up when kids get back to school.
Thank you, and ignore my dog barking for a moment. Etienne, a question from Kathleen and maybe also for Farah. If the EBT cards are increased, will it eliminate the meal sites? And if not, will children have access to both?
Yeah, I can answer that. So the policy is that PEBT benefits, children who are eligible for PEBT benefits are eligible regardless of whether or not their school districts or schools are providing meals. There's no provision on participation in both.
Farah, did you want to add anything to add on USDA? Sorry, Etienne, anything to add on your side?
Sorry, I realized I was on mute. Farah covered it all.
Okay, great. On also EBT, do undocumented families have access to the PEBT? Can either one of you speak to that?
So all children that would otherwise be eligible for free or reduced price meals if their schools weren't closed because of COVID are eligible for PEBT.
Yolie, if I can just note how important that is, given that undocumented folks are not eligible for many of the financial support programs in the CARES Act, and applying for such programs can be quite complicated for mixed status families. The fact that this pandemic EBT applies to all free and reduced price lunch eligible families is a big deal and an important opportunity to support vulnerable kids.
Great. Thanks for that add, John. There's a question about, and this might be Denise, an opportunity for you to jump in here. Are there any resources available to help parents determine whether or not they should have their children repeat a grade? What's the conversation on that you can share?
I'm actually going to defer to John on that. It is very much going to be a state and local decision, but I think John's been in more conversations than I am on actual practice.
You know, I think it's a challenging question because the evidence certainly at the secondary level on having students retained in grade is quite negative. And so the challenge here, I think, is to think about what are creative solutions to close the learning gap. And that may mean summer school, extended year into summer 21. It might mean expanded learning time during the school year. We think there should be dedicated funding for that, but that may mean after school, Saturday school programs, programs that might happen over vacations. It may mean being creative about restructuring the school day to make sure that students get intensive tutoring. There's very good evidence that intensive tutoring can help students make up ground quite quickly. So we may need to restructure the day, teachers' time, students' time to make that possible. There's also some conversation about the potential for looping as a strategy where teachers might have in the 2021 school year the same students they had in the 1920 school year, so that they're able to build on those relationships and get a quicker start to the next school year. So students would move up a grade, but they'd have the same teacher, so that teacher would know where they are and be better able to support them in the next school year. Of course, that works best when you have a very strong teacher with the right professional development and supports, of course.
Thank you, John. Ruth, Lisa Jensen Thompson wondered about whether you can expand a little bit more on tax credits for childcare programs that you had noted. What is being considered and how could this be advocated for at both the federal, state, and local level?
So that's a great question, and I have limited notes in front of me. We're not sure under the current rules how many childcare centers are actually using the fact that they can do paid and sick family leave, because so if you recall, one of the COVID packages required paid and sick and family leave, and what the feds did to pair that requirement is they created these tax credits, which essentially makes it so that the feds are paying completely for that sick leave. But there's an exception for small businesses with under 50 employees. So we are not sure. There's no real data on what programs have chosen to do along those lines, but there are 2 different tax credit programs that basically employers are able to take when they file for their payroll, that would allow them to recoup what they have paid for paid sick and family leave.
Great, hope that was a helpful answer. Probably more discussion needed on that. I'm going to read the last question and then we'll start to wrap up. And this is back to Farah. For benefits for families, are there additional considerations for other changes in benefits such as TANF, Medicaid, CHIP that might help families in response to COVID?
Well, I'm not actually sure this is a question for me. The person who asked, are you asking, are they considering change, is the Congress considering changes to other benefit programs to help families that are in need?
That might be the case, and maybe that's a Denise question. Are you seeing any broadly around the legislation, other considerations to benefit programs, Denise?
Um, I have to imagine, I'm not sure yet because they're just wrapping up the current very skinny package, which provides additional support for the small business loan program, as well as some new dollars for hospitals. Whether they will try to do some other income support programs, such as TNF. I know that there has been big advocacy around increasing SNAP benefits, additional advocacy around extending pandemic EBT into the summer and potentially into the fall, and as well as looking to see if we could do something with the child and adult care feeding program. But to be sure, there is a lot of conversation going on around supporting the stabilization of state and local government, because everybody is foreseeing a major shortfall. And if we don't have those additional investments for state and local governments, you'll find that they will just pull from their general education budget and other budgets that are available to them to backfill. And that will do a tremendous service to the kids and families that we all care about.
Thank you, Denise. And there was a question around supporting English learners. Thank you, John, for posting your response in the chat box. There's a link there that you could go to. It's a Colorín Colorado link. Lots of great resources and a great question to keep asking. We are a minute from our closing, so let me take this opportunity to thank all of you for sharing such a great amount of information. We know things are fluid and moving quickly, so I want to encourage everybody. We've shared everybody's websites and links to other information, so please take advantage of that. We want to continue to hear from you, your questions. So with that, let me thank John King, Denise, Ruth, Etienne, Vera, and Sharon, darling, for joining us on this webinar. We invite you to continue to participate in the GLR Learning Tuesdays webinar series that you'll see in the next slide. They're always on Tuesdays and always at 3 p.m. Eastern time. There was a next slide. So with that, I hope you all stay healthy, and there it is. I hope you all stay healthy and safe, and we will continue to bring you updates as we can. Thank you again to all our speakers and our discussant, and have a great day.
Thanks so much.